Because I'd also like to make sure he's included in the gender identity and the curriculum discussion.
Got it.
And there's sort of only so much we can move down. He also asked me please not to count on him arriving.
Okay.
So I get the sense it's a day job situation that's kind of important.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So we have on our agenda 3 items in sort of a discussion work session piece, and then 2 items in follow-ups, and then some next steps just to make sure we're keeping track of anything we want to do in December or early next year. So I wanted to just check in before we get going if anyone wants to add anything else to the agenda.
I don't have anything to add. I don't think. Something might come to me at another time, but I don't think I have anything to add.
Great, we'll add that on the fly then. Okay, so let's go ahead then and we'll start with social studies and then we can move to letters and then to gender identity. And then we'll loop Alistair in on whatever discussion we're on when he gets here, if he's able to come. So social studies. I heard from Siobhan Gibson at OSSE that while they are working as hard as they can on formatting the draft standards to be ready to be shared by mid-December, which is what they had processed, there are still a couple of things standing in the way. And what I wanted to do was just share with you all what I've heard so far from OSSE so that you have the same information that I do. So we all know that there's a lot of money to be going out the door for ESSERs, and that money has to be obligated, as I understand it, by January 5th. Because of that, there are a lot of items waiting in procurement to have contracts procured. This means that there is a long waiting list for contracting and procurement for any sorts of things that are trying to get out the door right now. Social studies and the work of having a contractor to support OSSE is also on that OCP waitlist because it does not have a federal deadline the way that ESSERS does. It is behind those ESSER procurements in the waitlist. What that means functionally is that OSSE is using its own person power to do all of the work of formatting the social studies into a survey, making any changes it needs to, communicating with the writing committee, things that had previously been really heavily leaning on its contractor to do. And that is, just tough because they don't have anyone whose job is social studies first and foremost. So Dr. Gibson is working really hard to pull this together as quickly as possible. And she and I are scheduled to have a conversation about this to just double check how we're doing on timeline. Because we did already speak with leadership about putting social studies as the panel at the December 15th meeting and asking outside entities, experts in social studies, including experts in DC history, experts in the social studies more generally, to come and speak about their take on the draft standards. In order for them to be able to do that, the standards have to be ready. So that's where we are right now with social studies and the timing. Questions on that before I talk a little bit about how that first round of engagement went on Monday night last week?
So if I'm understanding this right, you are still hoping that we'll get the stuff that they'll release the draft in time to get panelists for December, but your fingers are crossing that may not happen. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And we are going to push really hard to make sure that it does happen. I think, and I respect and understand this. I think that part of this is about the look of things, right? Making sure that the standards are in a visually appealing format for the public to easily engage with them. And I believe that is important. On the other hand, I think it's really important that we get these standards out to the public because we've told them that they're coming. So if I had my druthers, we might compromise a little bit on visually appealing and make sure that we got the standards out to the public in a format they could respond to them. I'm not sure that OSSE feels the same way. I think the visually appealing piece is a big part for them. And that may be that may be part of the holdup that we're trying to navigate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The other thing I should note is that there's also been some interest, as we understand it, from the Deputy Mayor for Education's office in talking with OSSE about the draft standards before they go public. And this is, I imagine, because of the national sort of political climate and conversations that are happening around the content of learning, and just wanting to be prepared for that. So if you hear that, we have heard that as well. We've heard that from OSSE as well as from the Deputy Mayor's office. And so there is a meeting forthcoming between the DME and OSSE to talk about the content of the draft standards and to make sure that everyone is clear on what is in our new draft standards and can prepare for any questions that may come from the press or others about that.
And Rep. Sutter,
Yep.
For that last part,
Yeah.
are you going to be included in that? Or is that a conversation we're not privy to?
It's a good question. So I don't think I'm going to be in that meeting, but I have had meetings with both members of the DME staff and with OSSE staff about that meeting. So that's where I think things stand. I do not think that, I think this is an internal meeting between two agencies of the mayor's administration. But they were both kind enough to let us know that they were happening.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yep. So two things that I wanted to make sure I talked about as part of this social studies update. One is how the first round of engagement went. And I will also defer to Dr. Reed here. We had 9 people take part in our first night of engagement. We only had one round for social studies, which frankly, I was quite grateful for. Representative Wattenberg, I don't know if you know this, but the night of Dancing with the Scholars, I had been quite ill all day and the prior evening with food poisoning. So by the time Monday came around, I still really hadn't eaten much solid food and was very grateful to only have one round of engagement to do before I got to go home. But we had 9 wonderful people come and engage with us in the standards, ask really good questions, and bring up some important feedback that Alex has gathered together in some notes from that first round. I would say the 3 things that I took away from that, and then I'll defer to Dr. Reed for any things she may think want to add to that. One is people had some really important questions about how the elementary standards help tee up some of the content that we're asking students in the middle and high school grades to work through. So we had shared some examples from the middle and high school standards, but not any from the elementary school standards. Part of that is some of the changes OSSE was making with the writing committee still at that point. So folks had a lot of questions about the foundational skills that we're making sure students have in the elementary grades in order to be able to do what we're asking them in middle and high school. I think that's a really important concern, and one that we as a board will likely share, making sure that we review it with that an eye to that the standards build from elementary through middle and high school so that students have the skills and knowledge they need. A second takeaway was families had good questions about what resources would be available to ensure that these standards were able to be equitably implemented across all 8 wards of the city in all schools, DCPS and charter, so that teachers were not expected to create materials on their own. So a couple of folks at the engagement session raised the point that, like, this is great content and I'm glad students are learning it, but I've not seen a textbook that includes this. So how will we provide curricular materials for this to be taught? And will there be an effort to do that in a way that ensures equity across the city? And then the last thing, we asked the question, like, what could the board and OSSE do to provide parents and community members with information to help them become familiar with the new standards, as well as to help reinforce them at home? And so folks had great suggestions there around, like, creating one-pagers on, like, this is this grade, this is what your students are learning this year. These are some activities you can do in the city or at home from your computer in order to help your students access and reinforce this content, or to take a look at this content for yourself if this is unfamiliar to you. So those were my sort of 3 big things. Dr. Reed, anything else you'd add?
Okay, back on camera. Yeah, it was great to listen because I think I remember you sent out the survey about social studies standards, and I found myself just kind of like, yeah, that sounds good, 5. And then I was like, wait, I'm giving too many 5s. I was like, I'm gonna wait until I can like dig into this content. And of course, sometimes it takes just being in a session to sit down and listen to it. And I think the reason why I was giving so many 4s and 5s was because it was just good material. It seemed like most of the people who were there were pleased. There was a member of the working group there. You can completely tell, I think, the passion that I saw online watching some of the sessions was still there, and it translated well in person. We also, I think, talked about like how, oh, wait, to your point about like one pagers related to like what your child might be learning this year. I think I'm listening to Representative Thompson speak about the topic we're going to talk about later, kind of hones in on that, because I do think parents and families, and then also having a friend who recently felt like some content from their school, they might want to introduce it at home. I think that's going to be helpful to get families engaged in what they feel they want their children to learn too, or balancing it, or be able to be ready at home, or provide supplemental learning opportunities. So I just think like, you know, it's just a good crossover that just so happened to be across topics about like making sure families are engaged in some of these topics, especially when we're not backing down, I think, off of some of the bad history, which I learned, what was that called? The hard history.
Hard history.
Hard history was a word or term that I learned during this session. You know, some of the hard history that families may want to, you know, insert their family's experiences or their lived experiences into. So I think that is helpful, and I think it just kind of is a full circle moment. And we also discussed some feedback I know from my neighbors is, you know, really for Ward 8, which is still very African American, really wants to get into like certain cultures, like, you know, how do we know that African American history is being taught? So, and I think somebody was still standing next to me when I said that, and they chimed in too. And we discussed the whole thing about cultures, like possibly as we're releasing social studies standards, as we're promoting the standards, highlighting how the standards emphasize the various cultures that are prominent in DC. In, you know, the work to kind of say like, oh, look, the new standards acknowledges this. So it was a robust conversation, but really good feedback on some like actionable next steps that I think are going to be important to families, and then what we're hearing stakeholders say.
Yeah, thank you so much for all that, Dr. Reed. And Representative Wattenberg, I think the other thing I would say is that it also highlighted the importance of our continued work with OSSI on this, right? That like, some of this we still as a state board can't do alone. So for instance, like after the standards come out, we could certainly take it on upon ourselves to make the one-pagers for families, right? We work with constituents, we'll have approved the standards. That is certainly something we can do. But to the support of schools with curricular materials, with training, that's certainly something that we are not going to be able to do and not in a good position to do. So continuing to collaborate with OSSI on that front is going to be really important. Any thoughts or questions on that?
My only question, Representative Sutter, when you say that the focus was more on the middle and high school because they were ready and not the elementary, so do we have the drafts on the middle and high school and just not the elementary for the public comment?
So we have a draft of everything from pre-K through 12. OSSI feels positively about the current content of the middle and high school standards as is. They still had questions that they wanted to go back to the technical writing committee about on the elementary standards. And I'll share sort of one example of that. So there was something that we flagged in the first draft of the standards when they came to us and to the CSAC that seemed, one, unclear, and two, developmentally inappropriate for a grade level in the elementary grades. When the draft was sent back as a like ready for public consumption draft, that had not been resolved. And so there's still a little back and forth between the writing committee and OSSI on things that OSSI thinks need to be changed. And the writing committee either doesn't agree with or hasn't yet been able to find a way to change. So we did not want to put that out for public comment. And since we'd agreed on this December 15th date, we highlighted the middle and high school standards because both OSSE and the writing committee agreed those are in a good place. They flow in terms of content and concept cleanly from 6th grade through all the high school courses, whereas the elementary grades still had some spot pieces that needed to be adjusted.
Got it. And then have we on the committee seen the middle and high school or not yet? I'm not suggesting we should have. I'm just wondering if.
Yeah, not yet. I'm happy to
Okay.
share. I think we did share. Did I? I think so. If I didn't, I can make sure everyone's seen the deck that was shared at the engagement session. But
I think we did get that.
okay, so there's a couple of excerpts in there that were shared, and again, like those were ones we talked about with OSSE to say like these are ones we'd like to share. We think they're good examples of how the content has changed from the old standards to the new standards. But no, we have not released, nor has OSSE released the middle and high school standards more completely yet. The last thing I wanted to make sure to update folks on was the panel. So Alex, if I can lean on you a little bit here, we had talked about some groups that we thought might work well to invite to the December public meeting to speak about the social studies standards and or to submit written testimony, because there are certainly more people that we want, I should say this, there are more organizations that we will want to weigh in on the content of the revised standards than we can fit in a panel. But we want to invite people to both provide us with written comment as well as to be present for discussion about the standards. And we talked about a couple of people that we might reach out to invite, and I wanted to run some of those by you. Alex, do you have our list handy? If not, I can dig through and find mine, but if you have it handy, I may lean on you for that. Fantastic. Alex put the link in the chat for the list of folks we talked about. So if you click on the link in the chat, it'll take you to that list and you can see the kinds of folks that we're thinking about and the way we've grouped the categories, specifically folks who focus on standards, folks who have a real focus on social studies more generally, both at a national and regional level, folks from museums who may want to weigh in, local folks, because we know that there's going to be specific sort of color and flavor to the way that folks will feel about the DC standards given their proximity. Can you all actually access this link?
You would have to give permission to one of my other accounts.
Okay, let me do this. Looks like I may be able to adjust I updated the permission for now, so try clicking the link again. The DC Google, whatchamacallit, like client automatically sets the security that you have to access it from a dc.gov account.
FYI, I'm not joining from my, okay, from my laptop as well. Okay.
Okay, cool. So mostly I'm sharing this list to see, one, is there anyone not on this list that you would want to make sure we reach out to and say, hey, here are the new draft standards, could you please weigh in? And then two, is there anyone on this list that would be of particular interest to you to hear from at a public panel at our December public meeting? I'll weigh in and say that I feel pretty strongly that it would be great to invite DC area educators for social justice to weigh in. Yep. To weigh in on the standards because it's made up of teachers, other educators locally who are already focused on doing exactly this kind of thing, reviewing the standards, working together to implement them in classrooms, working to make sure that the standards are culturally responsive and inclusive. So I'd love to get their take. I also just had a great opportunity to tour the DC History Center, and they have a new education program coordinator who actually attended our first engagement session, Dominique Spear. And I would love to have the organization weigh in on whether we accomplished our guiding principle of increasing the content of DC history throughout the standards from pre-K through 12. That was one of the things we as a board and the CISAC had asked for. And it feels like the DC History Center would be well positioned to do that. So anyone we're missing or anyone you definitely want to hear from?
I wouldn't, the DC chapter, the NAACP reached out recently about another issue, but they were just kind of really wanting to be looped into some other education things. So possibly them. And I do have an email. I just had to look through my emails to find her contact.
Cool. Thank you.
And I would add people who have really looked at teaching social studies history as a way of building up the content for reading. So Knowledge Matters would be an example. Another, maybe somebody from Baltimore who's working with Wit and Wisdom from Sony Santelisa's staff would be a second one. Trying to think who else would be in that category. And then another is Ravi Perry, who is at Howard and spoke to us. He was on that panel on that somebody had that I think Carlene was there with me, and I think Alistair was there, and you couldn't come, Jessica. Anyway, he just knew, he obviously knows a lot about this, so I'd include him.
Yeah, that was the Connecting Across Lines of Difference, right? The ethnic studies panel that Alistair put together.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that would be great if we could get Dr. Perry.
Ruth, what was the second person or organization you suggested related to Baltimore?
So the generic category is those that are involved in trying to beef up the content knowledge conveyed in social studies classes as a way of giving students the kind of the content knowledge vocabulary they need to really excel in reading comprehension. That's sort of the broad category. So there's the folks from Knowledge Works is, or Knowledge Matters, I guess is what it's called. That's one group. And then there's these, there's different curriculum groups that just have a lot of experience in it. And one of them is Wit and Wisdom, which it's a curriculum group, but they're used in Baltimore City. And folks in Baltimore are very excited about it. So I think that might be a good place to invite people from. I mean, I don't know that it would be that useful to have someone from the national, but someone from Baltimore who's actually using it, I think could bring a lot to bear.
I wonder if we could get maybe Ashley Berner, who's at the Johns Hopkins University Center on Education Policy. They did the curriculum assessment with Baltimore.
Yep.
That identified some of the gaps in the knowledge. So maybe Ashley Berner from Hopkins or David Steiner.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
I'm also thinking, I'm not sure if they can. I know the mayor's office has a bunch of different offices for different cultures, affairs. Can't think of all of them. I'm not sure if it'd be appropriate to loop those groups in because a lot of them also have commissions.
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea, Alex. We should find out which of the mayor's offices, like the Office on African Affairs, the Office on Asian American Pacific Islander Affairs, which ones have commissions and whether or not there's an opportunity to invite those commissioners or the chairs of those commissions to review. I also think that's something we can ask the folks at OSSI and the DME to discuss as part of their meeting. Like I said, didn't get invited to the meeting, but trying my best to whisper in the ears and get included certain questions and topics.
How about the folks from the place in Massachusetts, run by Danielle, who's now running for Senate or governor? You know what I'm talking about?
Yep. I do know.
Is it civic what?
Yep. Alex, we had her come speak to the CISAC. Same meeting that Hassan Kwame Jeffries came to speak at.
Yes, I know who, yeah, Danielle Allen.
Alan, thank you.
Yeah.
And she's actually now running for office in Massachusetts, but presumably there's a, you know, a director or a staffer or whatever.
Yeah, and I am not remembering the organization off the top of my head, and I feel very silly right now.
No, I mean, we've been at this for a while with a couple of organizations. I'm looking here. It looks like the Safra Center for Ethics. Is that accurate? That's where she was teaching. Well, we'll do some research and make sure we add that in. You also now have this link. So if there are other suggestions you've got, let's go ahead and drop those in. Alex and I are meeting after Thanksgiving. I think actually the Monday after Thanksgiving, to talk about who to invite specifically to be on the panel. But all of the folks on this list will be invited to review the standards, and we will do direct outreach to ask them to review the standards and to weigh in. So Representative Wattenberg, this goes back to what we talked about even at the start of this whole process, which was making sure that we really are engaging folks in taking a look at the standards and actively reaching out to folks we know will have a take on this, to make sure that they know that we're in this process and have the chance to weigh in during the time frame.
I've just tried to add a group, which I can't. So National Center for History Education would be another one.
Awesome. Got it. It looks like the permissions are to allow folks to comment. So we'll ask Alex to add that in the National Center on History Education. Okay. If other thoughts come up, feel free to drop them in as a comment on any of the categories here. So the standards focused, or the national or regional museums, or local. And then we can keep this list going until the standards are released. I'll also be sure to ask the same question at the working session of our full board, so that if there are other things that we have not thought about, but that members of the board want to make sure they get in, that they have the chance to do that at the working session. With that, I don't have anything else to share on social studies. So if there are any other questions on social studies, let me know. Otherwise, I will move us to a quick chat about the letters training.
There's also the Democratic Knowledge Project, is what Danielle Allen used to run.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing that up, Representative Wattenberg.
Okay.
Okay. So let's talk about letters training briefly, and then we'll give Alistair the floor when he is able to join. So what Alistair shared with me is that, and I saw this in the OSCE Look Forward. So if you get the OSCE Look Forward, it's in their professional development opportunities. OSCE is making available letters training to all teachers in DC. The WTU has also gotten excited about this and put it out in their news blast today. And Alistair had talked with Representative Chang had talked with President Poglayan about this. And I did not know this. She was an early literacy instructor herself, a reading instructor, and is really excited about this and finds this to be important and beneficial to her membership. Couple things to know. Alistair explained to me, which I was unaware of, that the full letters training is a 2-year process. And it involves both being instructed in the science of reading and teaching phonics, but also involves observation and support in that work in classroom. So having folks actually watching you do the work and be able to support this work fully. What is not included in this letters training opportunity through OSCE is a stipend. So teachers are not being offered compensation to participate in letters training. As I understand it, they are not paying for letters training, but they are not being compensated for participating in it. And it does seem like a substantial investment of time. It's also not being mandated by anyone. So teachers are volunteering to participate in letters training, but this may not mean that the teachers who are serving, say, children with greatest need for literacy instruction or strengthened literacy instruction are being targeted. This is really sort of an all call for DC teachers. So one of the things Alistair wanted to make sure we talk about and that our board think about is how we might use this opportunity to talk about additional ways that we can strengthen access for this kind of instruction to teachers. So one thing, to Ruth's point, we might advocate for payment, advocate for there to be funding dedicated to this, whether that be state level grants or stipends, or if that be LEAs compensating their educators to incentivize participation. Another thing we talked about is there are a lot of states right now actually pushing policy to mandate this kind of training. So North Carolina just did this, and I think the 74 million had a piece about that this week. Mississippi had talked with us about the fact that this was work that they've already done, right? They've trained all their teachers in this. So are there ways for us to leverage this pilot that OSSI's doing to think about ways to really deepen the commitment DC has to the science of reading? So thoughts, questions on that, ideas about how we as a board might get involved in this?
So just to add to what I said, I mean, I do think, and I know that in the run up to the council adopting the early reading focus, one of the issues, and I know Alice, I think has also talked about this, and I know is this idea that everybody should have the training. You know, when we heard from the folks from Mississippi and we heard from the folks from, I'm trying to remember who else talked to us, Louisiana, it was required. And I think personally, I would like for it to be required. That seems a heavier lift, but I would sure like to really create a lot of incentive for it. And I think we should make that, I will look to Dr. Reed, who I can see, although she can't see me. And maybe it goes to the advocacy committee. I don't know if that's the right place to do it or to do it as a resolution, but to really make this something that we really try to promote. Maybe we could do it with the WTU. Maybe we could do it with, some of the other groups. So that's.
I like that idea as well, Representative Wattenberg, and Representative Chang and I talked a little bit about that in thinking about how we would mandate it, I think there's a couple of questions that I wonder about. One is like, over what time frame? So if letters training is a 2-year endeavor, and the DC Reading Clinic is sort of a hyperdrive version of that, which does this in a 1-year path for their participants, how would we parse out, like, over what time frame might we expect this to happen? Is sort of one question I've got. A second question I've got is, this seems to be something that we're saying is necessary for the good of all children, right? That the science of reading and instruction, science-based instruction in reading, is essential for all children learning to read. So this seems to be something that would be wrong to say is just the purview of one sector and not the other. Like, we can mandate it for DCPS, but not for charters. So it makes the question of, like, is there a vehicle that would allow us to say, this is good for all children? So how do we say this is a requirement for all educators in the district? How can we get creative about opportunities to do and to say that, because we think it's good for all kids? So those are the two questions I came away with. Wonder if there are others on your mind as we would think about, like, how would we advocate for this? Like, is legislation the right way? Is funding the right way? Is compliance or data collection the right way? Like, what's the right lever to get this to happen?
The librarians funding bill that was passed earlier and that's up again, is that just DCPS or is that all schools?
It's just DCPS.
I mean, there are definitely things that we have mandated across the two sectors, not a lot, but you could argue that this should be one of them.
Good. Sorry, I was multitasking trying to get a contact onto the Google Sheet. So the question on the table is, how do we support the social studies I got social studies standards still stuck in my brain. Letters implementation across brain is shutting off today.
No, okay. I think
Across sectors.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions. It's like right now it's a pilot and it's voluntary. And I think the question is like, if our board wants to get involved in this,
Yes.
what should we advocate for? So one of the things Representative Wattenberg said is like the teachers get compensated for this. So like that's one thing we could advocate for. I think another is that we say this should be across both sectors and that there should be incentive to make it both sectors. And Representative Wattenberg said, yeah, we should also work to make this mandatory, not just voluntary.
Yeah, I agree. Cause like, well, I quickly read over the information in the that was sent about like adopting, and I saw which states adopted and the good things have come out of those states. I definitely think it is something that we should consider. How can we get this to be implemented citywide, given how mobile our students are from year to year? But also one thing I noticed, and I think kind of caught my eye and attention, was looking at that application process, because right now you have to apply to be a part of it. Like we know, our big LEAs are going to, they have the ability to do grant writing and, take time and energy to invest in it. And, it is going to be the battle of the smaller single site LEAs who are able to probably use Thanksgiving break instead of resting, or this holiday break instead of resting to, write this application. So I'm just curious about how do we, I would like to see it even be piloted, or there's even some ways to get some of the smaller single sites to participate. Because I know, again, when you make a grant competitive, sometimes folks get left out if they don't have resources, but we know we need that. I'm also wondering, and this is also me not knowing like the population for letters, what age level does it go to? Because if it could be implemented in anyone know? If it could be implemented in our universal pre-K program that OSSI has oversight of, I'm sure there'll be some providers chomping at the bit, and that will be good information, as well as great training to support the quality of our pre-K if the program extends that low age-wise. But yeah, any efforts to get it to go across sectors, and then how is this information going to be built into like a multi-year plan? What does success look like? I think maybe it was that Herb was mentioning for us. How can we keep it? Because in the sense of like, we have this, often what happens is, and maybe that's because of the OSSI grant might help with this a little bit, because I know that grant has a time component, but like sometimes it becomes flavor of the week and all of a sudden it gets chucked and something new comes in. But we need some certain programs to have some longevity so that we know things are working. That's all I got at the moment.
Those are all super helpful. I don't know what age. I just did a quick search and it looks like there's a couple of different versions of letters training. So I'm curious what's being supported by OSSI versus like what the universe of the possible is, because there is apparently letters for early childhood education.
Yeah, and it's probably going to depend on like what OSSI got, because this whole letter stuff, this letters initiative comes from some federal grant that OSSI won. So I guess it's going to be the grant conditions. But I'm also for like, how can we support OSSI in continuity again from birth to, graduation, so that, and this is an opportunity, again, we have the greatest amount of investment as well as access to preschool or pre-K in our city. So that'll be a great way of maximizing so that kids, when they enter school age or become school age, are off to a great start, at least with literacy.
So I have a multi-level suggestion, which is, so I think all of us really want all of our teachers, all the relevant teachers to get this, all the early reading specialists, or all the early reading teachers to get this. Part of what came up when the council was dealing with the early literacy bill was you want everybody trained. You also need somebody at the school who really can coach. I mean, you really need a specialist at the school who's capable of then coaching and taking, building on what people have learned and making sure that they're doing it right, et cetera, et cetera. And kind of related to that, and I don't quite know what Letters does on this, but I assume that part of what it does is it helps teachers screen. And then some kids need intervention. So if we have a system where everybody's getting the Letters training, but you don't have people at the school level who are coaches or capable of doing intervention, you sort of teed everything up and then you kind of drop it. So I don't want to take anything away from the let's do everything to get everyone to get this, but maybe it's also a way to include these other pieces in it so that it becomes a really important part of a broader early reading thing. And I will say, I just think there's so much interest on the council in this. They went from not wanting to do it to having a unanimous vote and overriding the mayor. So I think there's huge interest in doing this and doing it right. So, and then the second thing, so that's the one big multi-part thing. The second thing that I just want us and Aussie and everybody to be aware of and try to do the best we can. Maybe there's a way to involve Carlene, maybe there's a way to involve the new group on it, the RPP, which is, whenever you have mandatory implementation of anything like this, there's better and worse ways of implementing. There's better and worse ways of having professional development. You can definitely do something that's mandatory and across the board, and you just create a lot of backlash. And I think we want to be really, really thoughtful. We want all the people doing it to be really, really thoughtful about how to put this into place in a way where, schools and teachers really want to do it and get the support they need. So again, it's sort of part of the recommendations, but also maybe part of the RPP, and that it's the kind of thing that we really want to come back to and make sure it's going well and use the information that we're getting to make it better, et cetera, all the stuff that RPP should be doing, can be doing.
Yeah, that's helpful, Representative Wattenberg. So also thinking about how our board would advocate to make sure that this isn't just something that is offered to educators or required of educators and funded, but also that it be a priority to be studied like from the start, so that if this is something that we get to be a citywide initiative, that we're also studying how it's implemented, successive implementation, what we learned from that.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the first part that you mentioned, this idea of like the training, but also staffing. So that I think raises a question, and this is where I feel very out of my depth and hope we can tee this question up for Representative Chang when he joins us. But as I understand it, the Letters training is curriculum for educators on how to teach reading and spelling. So how to help students interact with the English language, written and spoken. When you think about people who are able to supervise, are you thinking like we should get this training also for administrators whose job it is to observe educators so that when they're making observations, they have the training to observe this effectively? Or are you suggesting we're advocating for adding an additional staff member whose job it is just to supervise early reading instructors?
So I wouldn't necessarily use the term supervise, although maybe that is where it leads. I don't think necessarily so. I'm thinking more of somebody at the school who is designated as, a reading coach. And DCPS already has such people, not necessarily charters, but that you be this, either you're designating a reading coach or you have a reading coach, and that this reading coach be super well prepared in understanding and coaching teachers who are implementing Letters, so that there's not a disconnect between a reading coach, if they exist, but whatever school you're at, that you're learning this, you're putting it into place, and there's some ability to get the help you need to do it well and to do it right over a period of time. That's one piece of it. And not necessarily supervisory, right? And then the second piece is, it may or may not be the same person depending on how a school is organized, is what do you do with the students who need special intervention? I mean, some schools have reading specialists who really know how to intervene, and some don't, which I think is crazy, frankly. But I think that's how we're now set up. And that's a gaping hole, period.
Yeah, that's helpful. I guess the reason I'm asking is because tomorrow, obviously the council is having their hearing on librarians, and I am wholly in favor of pushing our board to advocate for the kind of science-based instruction that we know is best for all students. I personally feel less comfortable with our board advocating that the council legislate another mandated staff position at schools. That feels to me a tricky place for legislation, but that's certainly something we should discuss as a committee. If we think our advocacy should extend into encouraging required staff positions for this work.
Or what if Representative Sutter has sort of a different way to think about it or frame it? It's not so much an additional staff person. That really would depend on the school. That's how we would say it, and that would be what we meant. But rather that at every school, there's some way for each teacher, each newly trained teacher, to get the ongoing training, the ongoing coaching they need. Maybe it's from the school, maybe it's from OSSE, maybe it's from an LEA. But it's not that we don't have to say the school has to provide it, but rather that somehow that teacher needs the coaching. And from the point of view of OSSE, if you're putting all this money into a program, it seems like you'd want that. And they may well have something. So something that we could build on. And then the other piece, same with the intervention, it's not maybe to say you must have an interventionist, but rather every school really needs to have somebody or some either individual or vehicle for providing the needed intervention in reading as, formulated, as diagnosed through these teachers, something like that.
Got it. Okay. Helpful. Are there other things on this that we should get at least into our notes and that we can return to if Representative Chang is able to join us, or shall we move on to the conversation that Representative Thompson asked about?
I'm done.
I am curious as to if we can become more knowledgeable on letters. I just did the quick scan during our public meeting when the information went out, but why did DC choose this method over others? Is it, culturally responsive? Because I don't want something that comes in play and then people are upset afterwards, which we can't help sometimes. But if there's anything we can, just feedback on, what other states have felt about it, both positives, negatives, just kind of figuring out why we chose this program for our city is kind of what I'm interested in hearing. But kind of a quick glance of the booklet, which I would imagine will have a lot of glowing traits. It seems like a decent program, but I'm just kind of curious, why, and what else could we have chose from? And I'm also curious to see what other folks, kind of to Representative Wattenberg's point, had to put in place to make the program be successful. Because outside of just the curriculum itself, but did they have to put other supports in place? Maybe supports that we aren't even thinking about. We think it's people who are trained in it or reading specialists, but it could be something else that's way out the box we're not sure of.
Yep. No, that's super helpful. I think teeing that up as another question, what else can we learn about it? And I certainly think Representative Chang is well positioned to help us answer that, because he's going to be the person with the most contacts and knowledge of that. Awesome. All right. Well, if Representative Chang is able to join us, we can circle back, and we'll certainly make time to circle back to this. Let's talk about the gender identity and the curriculum topic. So I had the chance to talk with Representative Thompson earlier today. She is in the air right now, the joy of travel around the Thanksgiving holiday. So wasn't able to join us, but called to share a little bit of what she heard. So from her constituent and the concern that led her to raise this in new business. So essentially a school, Representative Wattenberg, did you want to chime in?
Oh, no. Did I press something? I didn't mean to.
No, that's okay. She had heard a concern from a parent that at this particular parent's child's school, the curriculum was being adjusted in the middle of the school year in the pre-K grades, I think this is pre-K4 specifically, to address gender identity, helping students begin to learn about gender identity, about there being more than two genders. And this was not something that the family was aware that the school would be instructing in before they registered for pre-K. And this was a change that the school announced via communication with families during the course of the school year. So the family had reached out basically saying, you know, had I known this, this is not something I necessarily was comfortable with my school teaching my child in pre-K. And so I asked them to opt out and was told that I was not allowed to opt my child out of this instruction. And should I choose to do so, I would have to unenroll my child. That would be the only way my child could be excused from this instruction. So this struck for Representative Thompson a note of, well, what guidance is basically being given to schools? How are we encouraging schools to talk with families about shifts they may be making in the curriculum to align with some of the inclusive education standards that we just passed a resolution to celebrate from the state board? So we've acknowledged that we need our education standards and education curriculum to be inclusive of LGBTQ+ issues, including transgender students and their identities. We also note in that resolution that we want to equip educators with skills, techniques, content, training in order to do this in an inclusive way, as well as to address students in inclusive ways. I think the discussion point for us is sort of, how do we reconcile our ask as a state board and our push for the schools in the district with things like what Representative Thompson heard from a family, which is a school is making a switch in the middle of the year that would seem to align with our resolution in some ways, but which may or may not be developmentally appropriate. Having not been an early childhood educator, I don't know what is developmentally appropriate in talking about gender with 3 and 4-year-olds, ways to do that or not to do that. What kind of guidance are we providing as a state to LEAs? What kind of guidance are LEAs providing to their teachers on this? And how are they communicating with families? So the only other thing I'll say to start this is I heard about a similar issue from 2 Ward 6 schools, but both had a slightly more positive spin from the families I spoke with. One mentioned that last year during Pride, her child's school had talked about pronouns. And a few parents reached out to the principal and said, like, I'm pretty uncomfortable with the fact that you did this, and this is not something I wanted my child to learn about. And the principal's response, which seemed to be well received, was, our school celebrates all the members of our school community, and we honor the holidays and celebrations that go for all members of our school community in our city, whether it be Black History Month or Latin American History Month or Pride. And so what we did instruct students on was how some members of our school community prefer to be addressed, and how to be respectful members of our community by addressing them in that way. So that was apparently well received in this one school. But I'm not sure how much of that was an individual principal's decision about how to address this in this way versus some sort of more systematic guidance from the LEA. So really, I wanted to just open a conversation over, like, what should our board do about these issues, knowing that we just passed a resolution? Are there things we want to ask of OSSE or of LEAs? Are there kinds of information we want to gather from our schools or our constituents to understand how this is being implemented currently, or if there are questions or concerns? And Representative Thompson threw out this other idea, which I think is a really good one, which is, as we ask schools to start making changes to be inclusive, whether it be of new history or new ways of talking about history that have not perhaps been as present in our schools, or whether it be addressing students in more inclusive ways and creating the curriculum in more inclusive ways, how are we listening to constituents and their questions about this? And how are we asking schools and LEAs to hear those concerns and address them in ways that are responsive, but also humane? Sort of having conversations, recognizing that people come to these issues with different states of readiness, and how are we handling all that? So the floor is open. I don't really know what we can do on this, but I wanted to make space for us to talk about, like, what should we do as a board, given that we've passed a resolution about this particular issue and we're seeing some differences in implementation across schools.
I did talk to Representative Thompson about this. And the two things that kind of stuck out were like, how do you, and I don't know either, I'm an early childhood special educator slash special educator, but like address it in like an age appropriate ways so that children are just learning to grow and be tolerant and accepting of everyone, but also just being children. But also protecting, you know, all the children in the classroom, et cetera. But they're developmentally just children grow and explore. So that would be good guidance from Aussie. I'm throwing them under the bus, but they should have a technical assistance unit about how to do things, you know, kind of developmentally appropriate as different conversation. But like, I had a friend who came to me in the early grades, and maybe it's just a little more gray in the early grades, but like the conversation was segregation, and she was like, I'm not ready for my preschooler. Or I wish I would have had a heads up before my preschooler, you know, learn. And I'm guessing in the same circumstance, this family just wanted to have a conversation or just have their child grow and explore. It's also could be just a different case of, we don't know the specifics about what happened, that the school may have needed to take a stronger stance, because bullying and teasing can definitely happen, and maybe the school had to be a little more strong in their stance. But I'm just curious about, like, you know, knowing what this case was, you know, who is putting, like, who are the experts, who's available to schools to prepare. I mean, maybe the school already has someone on staff that is qualified to provide this content in an age appropriate manner, because we would not want you know, just a quick, you know, adjustment, and then were parents involved, and how did that go, and, you know, in regards to what curriculum was selected, or how the curriculum is even being designed. So I definitely are kind of like, how, I guess the bigger question is like, for concepts that different families might feel could be delicate, but we do need to have folks learn about just different people and beliefs, and but then there's also families who just kind of need support about, like, maybe I want to talk about this at home, or maybe I want, so like, I'm just kind of curious about how to, it's those are early grades, like, how do we go with like age appropriate, and like, what are children you know, done in a way that, like, some kids, it might not even been like on their radar as a topic, and now they're having a question that now parents have to turn around and have a conversation about. The parents, and then I'm just thinking out loud and black. Yeah. But I'm also thinking, like, what happens when the child, they have the conversation in the school, how are we equipping parents to respond? That's a big element too. If a child is, you know, taught to be tolerant at school, and the reception at home is something completely different, that can totally negate everything running school, or even open up the child to come back and have a different conversation with their peers. So I just think, as much as possible, just like awareness, but then making sure that we are, you know, tapping into people who have studied this and their expertise of, you know, how to do this in a kind of age appropriate way. Because it doesn't just happen with a subject, it happens with a variety of subjects that parents are like, whoa, I didn't even know that was something, you know. I'm thinking my little preschooler is learning about letters, or just role playing in general, or whatever. And, you know, you come home with a topic that you weren't ready to address, and then that just opens up more things. So.
Yeah, I'm noticing that too, Representative Reed. In our resolution, we resolve that OSSI should have guidance and that they should provide professional development. We don't actually mention parents in here. We don't mention like should equip schools or LEAs with, information on how to share these elements of the curriculum with families. So that may be something that we want to open conversation with OSSI about, that as we talk with them about implementing professional development and technical assistance on our resolution, what are they also doing for families, or who might be well positioned for that?
I don't have a lot to add to this because I really don't know a lot about it. It's, as Dr. Reed said, I'd be interested to hear from people who do know a lot about it. Certainly the guidance I think is super important. Just to pick up on two things that you both have talked about. I mean, I think the guidance for schools and teachers is super, super important. And the other thing is the parents and how you deal with that. I mean, obviously it created quite a stir in some other states during election time, and parents want to know, and being able to figure out how to do that is good. I don't know, and I don't know, but I think hearing from people would be, or understanding that, or I guess hearing from OSSI about what they're trying to do as well would be useful.
Yeah. That may be one thing that we ask for too, is if we can get someone to come and speak with our committee or with the board about the kinds of resources that are available at OSSI for schools as they implement changes to curriculum to be more inclusive, and sort of what LEAs can ask of OSSI, whether they've seen much uptake in asking for those resources, and if not, how we might encourage OSSI to better disseminate those resources to make sure that LEAs are aware of them. Okay. Anything else that comes to mind on this particular topic? Are there other things you think that our committee or our board should do on this?
Not us, but I'm thinking about throwing our sister agencies under the bus. The ombudsman or student advocate, because in this case, I think there's like placement, like the parents just like, whoa. It could be possibly, and I'm not sure like how broad, if we're talking about a specific case. Is it a micro choice?
Yeah, no, seriously. I said that to Representative Thompson too. I was like writing that down, adding it to the research panel.
Yeah, because from what I'm told, like the school is very like, no, we want to do this. And the parent is kind of like, if I knew at the beginning, I might not have made this choice. So it's kind of like, is this something that maybe the parent, and I would, in my head, I'm thinking about the child. How do we not disrupt a school year that's already just disruptive in nature? So it could be something for our student advocate, our sister agencies to just help both navigate, because I'm just thinking about this child of like, and even just a family, it's the holidays, like nobody wants to be sitting here researching new schools to go to. The added layer of stress of already something stressful. So if any way that those agencies could assist with getting a happy medium of, trying to develop a culture of tolerance and educating youth, and then also a family's need.
Yeah,
it's gonna be an emergent topic. But it needs to happen. Because I don't think, I'm just thinking about my upbringing. I don't even, we never. So it's also something of like our own kind of, this is why we need the education from OSSI and experts, because like, I wouldn't even know where to put, it's a topic that now, thankfully, we are giving more time and attention to. But it's really, I think, new chartered territory for the field of education. Like our community and those around us have been saying this is important, but then it's like, okay, now where do we insert it into our schools? So that's the big question.
Totally right. And again, this is a conversation Representative Thompson and I had as well, because it sounds like there's an element of faith-based concern here from this family, that the family holds particular religious beliefs that makes them concerned about having this conversation with their child at this age. And thinking about how we are supporting. I mean, schools are going to face all of this. And so as we at the state level of policy are saying, this is policy our schools need to implement for the good of all of our children, to grow and learn in safe and inclusive ways. How are we ensuring that the support is there to say, okay, what happens when you have a family make a faith-based objection to this change to their curriculum? What happens if you have a family make this kind of objection, or a developmentally appropriate objection? What are some, I mean, honestly, one of the things I was thinking about is like, what are even some model scripts on how you begin the conversation with the family to try not to have it immediately, have it immediately devolve into, if you don't like it, you should go somewhere else. Like, that's not great. That's not a great answer. I don't think anyone would feel good about that answer when it comes down to it. But in the absence of having some sort of like technical assistance that says, when you're up against something like this, here are some ways you might go about it, I think we're going to see, to your point, a lot more of this. I will say, in the example that the one word 6 mom shared with me, she said she was referring to a student who she had met at the school and said, oh, so-and-so, she, and her son tapped her on the shoulder and said, no, mom, so-and-so's a he. And she was like, oh, right, sorry. And he's like, that's okay. We have to remember the right pronouns. And her son was like 9, was like, no big deal, mom, just get it right. So I think too, the children probably have things to teach us on this front as we're figuring it out. But yeah, I think that's a good call to rope it, the ombudsman and the advocate's office, and think about both this particular case, but also like, have they seen an uptick in these kinds of questions from families, or can they count for us that when these issues come up, so that we can start to log and share with OSSI. Yeah, I love that idea too, Representative Wattenberg. All right, so there were 2 things I wanted to follow up on. One was the virtual learning standards, and then one is the future standards revision. Alex, I'm gonna lean heavily on you here as well. So have we heard anything back from OSSI at the staff level about our virtual learning standards request?
No, we have not.
Okay, it's a pretty quick update. Do we have any sort of typical procedure or protocol for how long we wait before we send a second email, so to speak?
I don't know, actually. I don't, to be honest. And I don't know if there's, I don't know if there's a specific amount of time that we typically wait. I think that it's probably a valid question, and one that might be worth exploration when we do engage with other agencies and entities. But it is my understanding that we transmit and hope for responses. Sometimes in our letters, we ask for responses by particular dates. I don't think that was in this letter. And I personally have not even received confirmation that the letter was like even received.
Okay.
I mean, it was sent. I'm sure it was received.
Sure. So maybe one thing, and I'm curious, Representative Reed, what you think of this. Could we ask leadership to ask this? Okay, go ahead.
That's what I was going to ask. When is the next leadership meeting with OSSI, and can this be one of our questions?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Can we add it to the December leadership meeting to follow up on that?
For sure. I will make that note.
Awesome. Cool. Anything else on that topic, Representative Reed?
Yes, or maybe it's going to another topic. I noticed in the list of standards that were included, technology is one. Not sure if that's a way of addressing, or that's something different, because I kind of clicked around. I could see it was like use of media, that kind of thing. But even like if we were to ever update those standards, a preface around virtual learning could go in there, but it will also be up to OSSI to ramp those standards.
Oh, the embedded technology standards that we haven't looked at since 2009?
Yes, who actually, William O. Lockridge, who he danced for his foundation, was the Ward 8 representative on that embedded standards. But I just kind of like scrolled through seeing technology, and then also knowing we hadn't heard a response. So I was like, oh, I wonder if this could be a vehicle to slide in some virtual guidance.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, and I think it's emblematic of the changes that have happened in our education landscape since 2009. So, Representative Wattenberg, this is something you've brought up a lot. Like, there are some standards that really are in need of updating and others that may not, the content or the context may not have changed that much so as to require their updating. But like, my goodness, the difference between the technology we had in 2009 and the technology we have now. I think I still had a flip phone in 2009. Not the 2 iPhones I have sitting in front of me next to my laptop across from my tablet. Like, life changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I am also curious, I will say, whether there are any ongoing discussions in the city about one of the questions we'd asked in our letter was around like ongoing virtual learning settings. And I feel like I've heard some noise about there being an interest, at least at the older grades, in having some sort of like access to more permanent virtual education, especially for things like credit recovery. So it would be interesting to see whether, that may be another avenue for linking in with the virtual standards, which is like what opportunities exist to create more sort of permanent virtual learning settings, and what standards would be required for that, especially if they go outside of what we typically think of as the domain of K-12, but rather the things that we know are still necessary for all our kids to grow and thrive, like credit recovery.
So the next leadership meeting between OSCE and the state board is December 13th. So I will make sure that this gets added to that agenda.
Cool. Thank you. All right.
Question: does our leadership ever meet with the DCPS chancellor? I know he came to one of our working sessions, but I don't know, do we, or I guess the DME would be then the next.
I don't believe so. It is my understanding that leadership has monthly meetings with OSCE as well as DC Council.
Yeah, what I would say is there's almost, I don't even know if it's by statute or not, but because we're a state board and they're the state agency, there's a regular monthly meeting with OSCE, and they can and do, I mean, I certainly did with other leaders as needed on whatever basis they and the other leaders choose to do so,
Yeah. I just say that for 2 reasons. One, I distinctly remember during that working session, he said that they were thinking about, not related to COVID, but for older grades, possibly some innovation for like permanent, like related to virtual for the middle school, high school, and there were going to be some possible contingencies with that. And that was stuck in my mind. So I'm just curious if that was something that he was still interested in. I do know how that could be confusing with the executive stance on getting people in person. But once we get that solidified, I would like for, just kind of an update on, is this something that, they're going to follow up on, not follow up on? And then again, yeah, I'm also just thinking, then how do we balance across LEAs again with having at least 3 charter entities, I think 3, move to permanent virtual options? How do we have like a by right virtual option, I guess, if that would be if DCPS picks it up? And then, the use of, I know a few families who just decided to connect through, is it K through 12? Something, use a technology that they found on their own. So I'm just, I would like feedback or a response or something, update related to that.
Yeah, I think that's more than reasonable that we would like a response to it and would like to follow up. So,
and can I just say, I mean, I think on that DCPS point, they've been so resistant to it. They've been resistant to it seemingly, at least, what they say is because they feel like people won't get as good an education virtually, but it would be such an important thing going forward. I mean, people get sick, different things happen. It would be such a great thing for them to have in general, and to have, criteria for how you get in. I mean, that is not for everybody if that's not what they want to have, but for specific kids and specific situations, and maybe, they could be as COVID goes away in a funny way, maybe they feel freer to do the right thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions too we might think about, Dr. Reed, is that if we think there are questions that are DCPS specific, do we want to send an amended version of our letter or a couple of questions specifically to the DCPS intergovernmental affairs person, Alyssa Knopf, that we can all regularly communicate with, and see if we can't get some answers from the largest LEA. Okay, so I'll make sure that this goes on our December agenda so that we can revisit whether we've heard back from leadership, from OSCE, and can go from there. The other item on the agenda for tonight was the future standards revision. So we had made a short survey and we asked folks at the engagement session to fill it out. Obviously, we only had a couple of people at the engagement session, so we only had one response. We did keep it open until the 10th, and we're going to have obviously the second engagement session on December the 4th. But I do think Alex asked a question in our notes about whether we could share this short survey on, and this is a survey on what other standards should the state board take on now that we are wrapping up our work on the social studies standards, and what order should we take them on in. That maybe we should share this survey on its own outside of the engagement sessions to get public input on that. I actually kind of like that idea, and I think maybe we could do it in the new year. One, I don't want it to come too close on the heels of some of the other surveys we've sent out for STAR, because I think, we've been pushing really hard to get feedback on those, and I don't want to confuse people or ask them to do too many surveys at once. But I also think we're not going to take any action on new standards, at least until the new year. So I think that makes sense to me. So that was our update there. Any other questions about future standards revisions or where we're headed with that? I love this point though, Representative Reed, about the embedded technology. Now you've got me thinking, like, maybe that's one we nudge people towards.
Leverage what you got. I know we were talking about documenting the process that you took for social studies standards so that we can review, or we can do that again for other standards revisions. Where is that the plan? Okay. It is
still the plan, and we have not moved any further ahead on that. To my understanding, Alex, you and I talked about this. We have the article from NASB that pretty nicely lays out what we did with the social studies. You started another draft that captures the sort of generic version of those things, but we haven't, as a committee, taken this any further yet.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is in my court, but I would say I am kind of waiting to have the social studies process be a little bit more full circle, so that in drafting the document, I know exactly what the end looks like. But yeah, it is kind of in progress.
I am also in favor of that, because I think we're learning a lot right now about what the end looks like, which is that, and this is not a criticism of our state education agency, but insofar as we have a state education agency that does not have departments dedicated to each of these standards, it will rely on external support for that. And we're learning now that when that covers over a fiscal year, you run into some contracting delays in continuing that. So that may be a play for us to advocate to our state education agency and to council that our state education agency should build up some more departments that focus on areas of standards that we have. But in the meantime, I think we're learning a little bit about how it affects the timeline.
Yeah. And also it's what we've done so far, though I think a really good and robust process, I don't think necessarily is going to be the one that we might at the end of the day suggest and propose, noting one thing that Representative Sutter just said, but there are other learnings that will probably be like, well, we did do this at the beginning because we thought it would be good, but this is where it led us. And it actually could have been improved if we would have done it a little bit differently. But I do think the first step will probably be to see the social studies a little bit more full circle, put that process down physically on paper, and then react to those different parts as a committee and see what might need to be changed or altered or retweaked, if you will.
No, I think that's exactly right. So that we can suggest iterations to improve the process going forward. First time out of the gate, it's never going to be the best time. All right, I don't have anything else then. So on next steps, we're going to revisit obviously this codification of standards. I do think we want to make sure that we give Representative Chang a chance to share with all of us more details about letters training and to respond to some of the questions that we generated today that he may have some factual answers on or suggestions on how we get more information or responses to. Like, that's a great idea. I think our board should advocate on, or actually I had that idea and think it's terrible for these reasons. So want to make sure that we'll share these notes with Representative Chang and give him time to weigh in and respond. I will go back into our work plan and make any other updates on things we've completed. And I will make sure that I get back to folks as soon as we are back from Thanksgiving about the latest and greatest on the social studies standards. I am hoping to talk with Dr. Gibson at OSSE before we break for the holidays, but definitely we'll share back an update with everyone when we are back from the Thanksgiving holiday. Anything else for the good of the order? Cool. Well, then I will see you bright and early tomorrow morning to talk about assessment and accountability. And then I will wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. But since I'm going to see you tomorrow, I'll save that for then.
I can't wait. I'll see you all in the morning.
All right. And this Snoopy dog, I will give you that as my farewell.
Oh.
She has curled her large frame into a tiny little croissant.
Very cute.
All right. See you all tomorrow. Good night. Thanks for this.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.